I was totally thrilled to be invited to speak to this fabulous conference. I particularly love this conference theme, sow justice, reap peace. That says it all in 4 words. Extraordinary. I'm also very proud to be a member of Veterans for Peace. We stand together in the great cause in a defining moment in our nation's history, as well as in the human experience. The truth on the war in Iraq is finally penetrating the national consciousness. The majority of Americans now realize it was a mistake. And of course, we now have top generals testifying to Congress that our invasions and occupation have brought Iraq to the verge of all-out civil war. Those who made the decision to go to war in Iraq obviously forgot one of the important lessons of Vietnam, perhaps because they couldn't be bothered to serve at the time. That lesson is that conventional warfare against an unconventional opponent is a self-destructive act. And I'll say more about that later. Meanwhile, the debate is pretty much over on the issues of peak oil, climate change, and a collapsing U.S. dollar. They are all real, and they're giving birth to a perfect economic storm that is poised to bring a dramatic change in every aspect of modern life. Now, the good news, the upside of all of this, is that Americans are finally waking up to the reality that business as usual is leading to global social, economic, and environmental collapse, thus creating the opportunity to engage a new conversation about the nation we want to be and the world we want to leave to our children. The time is at hand to turn the human course from war to peace, from violence to healing, from domination to partnership, from empire to earth community. It has become evident that those who command the institutions of political and corporate power in this country are incapable of providing the needed leadership in this great work. Therefore, that leadership must come from grassroots citizens' movements like Veterans for Peace. That is why we're here. Our work is part of the challenge summed up in the prophetic opening words of the Earth Charter. We stand at a critical moment in Earth's history, a time when humanity must choose its future. I've devoted 4 years to writing The Great Turning from Empire to Earth Community to examine the nature and implications of the choice now before the human species. And it's led me to a deep examination of the sweep of the human experience and of our unfolding awareness of the possibilities of our nature and of our place in creation. Our contemporary problem actually began some 5,000 years ago when our ancestors put aside the more egalitarian and gender-balanced ways of earlier human societies and established the rule of domination by bow and sword. And since that time, a brutal competition for power has created a restless play-or-die, rule-or-be-ruled dynamic of violence and oppression. Conquest became a measure of greatness. Male gods displaced female gods. The wisdom of the elders and the priestess gave way to the arbitrary rule of powerful kings. We humans lost our sense of attachment to earth, and societies became divided between the rulers and the ruled. It began some 5,000 years ago in Mesopotamia, the land we now call Iraq. Thus we can see empire has come full circle, as the land of the first empire is the land in which the most powerful and hopefully the last empire appears destined to exhaust itself. Since that fateful early turn away from Earth community, imperial institutions have systematically denied the humanity of the vast majority of humans and reduced them to conditions of servitude that deny their humanity while elevating to the highest positions of power the most power-driven and ethically challenged among us. I'll not delay to provide examples here. To this end, the institutions of empire have systematically diverted a major portion of the resources available to human societies away from meeting the needs of people and nature in order to support the military forces, prisons, palaces, temples, retainers, and propagandists required to maintain a system that concentrates wealth and power in the hands of an elite class and secures the members of that class against the justified wrath of those consigned to conditions of literal or virtual slavery at the bottom. In other words, our current situation has a long history. Throughout history, ruling elites have limited the competition for positions of power at the pinnacles of institutional authority by denying the humanity of whole groups of persons based on race and gender, and arbitrarily consigning them permanently to the bottom. Racism, sexism, classism, environmental devastation, war, and poverty are all inherent consequences of the rule or be ruled dynamics of imperial cultures and institutions. And all of these will be with us for so long as we allow cultures and our imperial cultures and institutions to define our values and relationships. On a finite planet, peace, equity, and sustainability are inseparably linked. Now, what is special about our time is that the era of empire finally has reached the limits of exploitation that people and planet will tolerate. And the social breakdown and the environmental breakdown we see all around us are manifestations of this. If we continue with business as usual, future generations are likely to look back and refer to our time as the time of the great unraveling, a time of environmental and social collapse. Now, fortunately, it is within our means to move beyond empire, to give birth to a new era of Earth community based on a more mature understanding of our responsibilities to one another and to Earth. Buddhist spiritual teacher Joanna Macy suggests that if we are successful in negotiating this transition, future generations may instead speak of this as the time of the Great Turning, the time when humanity turned from the way of domination and embraced the way of partnership. Now, over this period of 5,000 years, we've seen the primary institutional form of empire morph from the city-states of ancient time to the imperial nation-states of the modern era, and more recently to the imperial global corporations of our time. What remains constant, however, is the pattern of domination and exclusion. The good news is that we now have an opportunity to navigate the turning away from empire that has eluded our species for 5 millennia. Radical and potentially devastating change that will shift the economic advantage from global corporations to local communities is now all but guaranteed by the mounting forces of a perfect economic storm, born of the convergence between peak oil, climate change, and a U.S. dollar meltdown. Now, as I'm sure you're all aware by this time, peak oil occurs when global oil production peaks and begins its inexorable decline as continued rising demand sends prices soaring. We may have hit peak oil last year in 2005. It may not be for 10 years or even 35 years in the future. But as Fortune magazine has pointed out, the difference is irrelevant. We must act immediately to eliminate our dependence on oil because the era of cheap oil is over. And here are some of the implications for how our lives will change. Long-haul transport and global supply chains, relics of a dying era. Auto-dependent suburbia, strip malls, shopping centers, and box stores like Walmart located in the middle of nowhere. Out of business. Oil-dependent industrial agriculture. Goodbye, Walmart. Oil-dependent industrial agriculture, finished. Well, we do need our food, so we're going to have to get growing with those backyard gardens. Now, does anybody see any oil dependents here, by the way? These, of course, are the military forces on which we depend to secure our access to cheap oil. Obsolete. As oil prices inexorably rise, much of our existing capital stock will be reduced to stranded assets. relics of a dying era, including much of the supporting capital of our sprawling and unsustainable suburbs. Options for converting automobiles to other power sources may be limited, although this is a prototype currently under testing. The consequences of peak oil will be exacerbated by climate change. During the 20th century, global mean surface temperature of the planet increased by 0.6 degrees Celsius. Projections of the increase anticipated by the end of the current century range from 2 degrees to 4.5 degrees Celsius. We're already experiencing an ominous trend in weather-related natural disasters. From the decade of the 1950s to the first 5 years of the 21st century, and that, of course, is within the lifetimes of most of us in this room, the average annual of weather-related natural disasters increased from 24 per year to 350 per year. Hurricanes Katrina and Rita are but a foretaste of what lies ahead. According to a study commissioned by none other than the Department of Defense, we can expect as a consequence shorter growing season and a 10 to 25% global loss of crop yield, water shortages, increase in forest fires, famine, disease, and severe weather events, endemic resource wars, and uncontrolled migration. Looking to war as a solution can only accelerate the depletion of resources and accelerate the collapse. The third element of the perfect economic storm, a meltdown of the U.S. dollar, is the consequence of a growing U.S. trade deficit, which in 2005 hit $750 billion and growing. Growth in the trade gap is a measure of the extent to which we in the United States are living ever further beyond our own means, running up a credit card debt to the rest of the world, and leaving the bill to our children. It is also a measure of the rate at which we are hemorrhaging both the family wage jobs that created the U.S. middle class and the manufacturing, technology, and research capabilities that go with those jobs. On the day the rest of the world tires of selling on credit to an economic deadbeat, this economic house of cards will come crashing down, and along with it our profligate ways. If we choose to allow the great unraveling to play out as a last man standing competition for the final remaining resources of the planet, we can anticipate escalating military conflict and terrorism leading to feudal fragmentation as after the fall of the Roman Empire and possible nuclear Armageddon. Or we can make a collective choice to turn away from the violence and injustice of empire to bring forth a new human era grounded in the principles of community, justice, and nonviolence. Unfortunately, our ability to make the obvious choice for life is seriously hampered by ill-advised economic policies crafted by right-wing extremists who have taken over our political system. These extremists are committed to an elitist agenda that pursues imperial wars and occupation in the name of advancing peace and democracy, and gives priority to corporate profits at the expense of the well-being of our children, families, communities, and nature. Now you might be asking, how do the self-serving champions of violence and greed achieve our willing participation in destroying so many of those things we most value? The answer, I submit, lies in the power of the stories by which we know ourselves and our world. We humans live by the stories that define our values and our understanding of our relationships to one another and to creation. By manipulating these stories, the institutions of empire create a kind of cultural trance that blinds us to our higher possibilities. For example, consider our national story. One of the things that I found most unsettling as I did my research for The Great Turning was the realization that the belief with which I had grown up, that the United States was actually founded as a democracy with institutions that embody the highest expressions of the democratic ideal, is yet another of empire's many lies. It's the same for the story that since our founding, our nation has sided with the oppressed internationally by promoting peace, democracy, human rights, and economic justice throughout the world. Ending hereditary monarchy and introducing the separation of church and state to bring an end to theocracy were indeed important advances implemented by our founding fathers. Beyond those accomplishments, however, much of our favored national story is actually a self-limiting myth that serves elite interests by denying the need for continuing struggle in the pursuit of the democratic ideal. Consider these well-known facts. Our Constitution was written by white male landowners. It was written to enshrine their power. The land we occupy was taken by force and deceit from Native Americans. Much of that land was worked by slaves. Women didn't get the vote until 1920. And we have regularly dispatched our military forces abroad to protect or advance private overseas commercial interests unrelated to the physical security of the United States. Now, even with the progress toward democracy achieved through 2 centuries of popular struggle, daily events continue to demonstrate to anyone who is paying attention that our nation still falls far short of realizing the democratic ideal. In the words of Francis Moore Lappé, to have the democracy we thought we had, we must take it to where it has never been. Now consider the perverse cultural story that tells it is our human nature to be violent, individualistic competitors and profligate consumers. By this reckoning of the story repeated to us continuously day by day, the idea that we might choose to live by the principles of Earth community would have to be dismissed as a naive idea contrary to our nature. But here again, we are dealing with yet another of empire's destructive lies. Psychologists who study the developmental pathway of the human consciousness report that those of us who enjoy the requisite emotional support from family and community traverse through our lifetimes a pathway from the undifferentiated, now-centered, self-referential consciousness of the newborn to the highly differentiated, timeless, inclusive, spiritual consciousness of the wise elder. In short, we are a species of many possibilities. It is our nature to cultivate the potentials of the spiritual consciousness that the cultures and institutions of empire systematically deny. Greed and violence in adult humans are symptoms of developmental pathologies systematically cultivated by imperial cultures and institutions. Again, I don't need to mention any names, because tragically, those afflicted with these pathologies often make their way to the highest levels of dominator power, where they use their positions to perpetuate the stories that celebrate their own greed and violence as divine virtues. Perhaps it's time for a change. This misdirection plays out as well in the cultural stories by which we define the pathway to prosperity, security, and meaning. Consider how each of these familiar stories reaffirm empire's relationships of domination. The imperial prosperity story says that an eternally growing economy benefits everyone. Economic growth requires wealthy people who are able to invest in enterprises to create jobs. Thus, for the good of society, we must free wealthy people from the taxes and regulations that limit their ability to accumulate substantial fortunes. I bet some of you have never heard that before. We must also eliminate welfare programs that strip away the incentive for poor people to become productive members of society, willing to work hard at whatever jobs the market chooses to provide them. Time to change that story. The Imperial security story tells of a dangerous world filled with criminals, terrorists, and foreign enemies who must be controlled or removed by strong police and military forces. I guess we've heard that one before also. Then there's the Imperial meaning story, which tells of a God who commands us to go forth to establish dominion over the earth, rewards the righteous with wealth and power, and mandates that these righteous, wealthy rule over the poor who justly suffer divine punishment for their sins. We may not know what those sins were, but they must have been horrendously awful. And meaning is found in obedience to God and his appointed representatives. You may notice a pattern here. Each of these imperial stories legitimate economic inequality, the use of physical force to impose the will of rulers, while affirming the special righteousness of the rich and powerful. Now, we all hear these stories over and over again. They tend to just seep into our consciousness, and one of the things we have to learn to do is to recognize them instantly for what they are. And they are fabrications. They're fabrications of reality intended to serve a political purpose. Now, although it may seem absurdly simple, the key to changing the course of the human future is to change the stories by which we live. And it begins with finding the courage to break the silence and speak openly the truth we know in our hearts, so we may reach out to find one another and end our isolation by forming communities of congruence that link and grow, so together we can speak with a clear and audible collective voice to change the prevailing cultural stories, facilitate the liberation of the higher orders of human consciousness, and change the course of the human future. So at this point, some of you may be asking, yeah, that's all nice, but what about the reality of our politically divided nation? Could we possibly build a national consensus around a commitment to the values of Earth community? I believe we can. For all the talk of red states and blue states, U.S. polling data reveal a startling degree of consensus on key issues. We are, in fact, mostly purple. And we already share a strong consensus on many basic values. A poll taken just last December reported that 90% of us agree that big business has too much power. Well, I think that's a pretty good start. A recent poll, other polls report that 83% of us believe that as a society, the United States is focused on the wrong priorities. Supermajorities of more than 80% want to give higher priority to children, family, community, and a healthy environment. In other words, Americans want a world that puts people ahead of profits, spiritual values ahead of financial values, and international cooperation ahead of international domination. There's extensive polling data on each one of these. And I want you to note something about these values. Could you identify any of them as distinctly conservative or liberal values? No. They are, in fact, deeply shared human values. And they are not distinctive to our culture either. In fact, we are one nation, yearning for healthy children, healthy families, healthy communities, and healthy natural environments. So let me see the hands. How many of us here in this room are part of this national consensus so defined? If you're part of this consensus, raise your hand. Okay, look around. I guess we got most. Oh, okay, thank you. There's a very important message here. We are not representatives of an alternative fringe minority. We are the leading edge of a national supermajority, and it is appropriate for us to speak and act accordingly with clarity and confidence. Contemporary scientific findings point to a profound yet elegantly simple insight that appropriately frames the new stories it is ours to tell. Relationships are the foundation of everything. Whereas Newtonian physics was based on a premise that only the material is real, the new quantum physics suggests that the material is an illusion. Only relationships are real. The new biology teaches that by the very nature of how life manages energy, life can only exist in living communities. And psychologists tell us that healthy relationships are the key to achieving a mature human consciousness. True prosperity, security, and meaning can be found only in the life of just, vibrant, interlinked communities that support every person in realizing their highest potential. Okay, so what does this mean for Veterans for Peace? Through this organization, those of us who have served in the military come together as a community of congruence from which we are able to speak with a clear and credible voice the truth that the current circumstances make conventional warfare against insurgent networks that blend in with civilian populations a futile, self-destructive, and immoral act that undermines our national security and our national moral fabric. Real security depends on building just communities, locally, nationally, and globally. Sow justice, reap peace. So simple, so obvious, and so profound. We of Veterans for Peace must work to bring this simple truth to the fore of the national consciousness and make it the defining narrative theme of our new national security story. Debates about whether a particular war was necessary and just are irrelevant. Our concern is with the current human circumstance of easy access to powerful, readily concealable weapons and instantaneous electronic communication, which make efforts to control territory by military force futile and render conventional warfare obsolete. If there is to be a human future, we must make a collective human choice to cooperate in the great work of turning the human course away from the pathologies of empire, bring justice to the world, and embrace our potential to live with one another in peace, caring, and cooperation. This is a defining moment for our nation and for our species. The work of the Great Turning is not to fix empire with adjustments at the margin. Rather, it is to birth a new era in a choice grounded in a choice for life and new institutions that restore to people, families, and communities the power that the institutions of empire have usurped. And we cannot wait for the leadership in this great work to come from within empire's corrupted institutions. Of necessity, that leadership must come from people like us and organizations like Veterans for Peace. We must work together to break the silence, end the isolation, and change the story. Please use the Great Turning as you can as a resource for personal study and for engaging your friends and colleagues in discussing the great work of our time. Check out the greatturning.org website for group discussion guides and links to other resources for engaging your community in an Earth community dialogue. And I hope you're all familiar with Yes Magazine. If not, hey. If not, I urge you to correct this deficiency in your life right now by signing up with Susan Gleason for a subscription out in the lobby as you leave. As those of you familiar with the magazine know, we created Yes to serve as a resource for those who are engaging the work of the Great Turning by providing inspiring stories, ideas, and resources for action. Changing the stories that frame our national discourse in the United States is central to our mission at Yes. Our summer 2006 issue is on the theme of the Great Turning, and there are some complimentary copies out there for you. And check it out at www.yesmagazine.org. Our distinctive human capacity for reflection and intentional choice carries a corresponding moral responsibility to care for one another and the planet. We must now test the limits of the individual and collective creative potential of the species as we strive to become the change we seek. In these turbulent and often frightening times, it is important to regularly remind ourselves that we are privileged to live at the most exciting moment of creative opportunity in the whole of the human experience. The future is in our hands. Now is the hour. We have the power. We are the ones we've been waiting for. Thank you. Thank you.